This week on the 77% Street Debate.
How many times are we covering young people that are doing exceptionally well, whether it's in small businesses that they own, how they're disrupting narratives?
Isn't it the job of the journalist to convince people that this story matters?
There is still an old style of thinking that if it bleeds, it leads. That's the only kind of thing we're going to run.
Hello, I'm Tomi Oladipo, and this is 77%. Now, the war in Ukraine, the COVID-19 pandemic, these are stories that have dominated the news recently. But what about major stories from Africa that don't grab the world's attention? Here at DW Global Media Forum, we've got together a group of media professionals from Africa and abroad to discuss the stories that matter. Let's start with our panel, and very quickly I'll start with Aldrin. You are a presenter and you are on TV and radio on South Africa's SABC. Can you tell us what stories matter to you very quickly?
Well, it all depends on what we're covering on the day. It could be that a shack fire in Cape Town is the most important story of the day, even though you have people dying in the DRC.
But what would you like to see covered?
I think human interest stories, first of all, outside of just the numbers. Let's deal with how this is having an impact on the human, first of all, outside of the numbers again. So this is about human beings, the sufferings, but also, very important, it's also telling the good story. It's not just about the ugly story.
All right, very quickly, let's come to Adenike, a climate activist from Nigeria. Now, what matters to you? What stories matter to you?
Yeah, what matters to me most is the fact that trying to see how humanitarian crisis is getting worse every day, looking at the situation in Lake Chad, the Niger Delta region, and recently IMF, International Monetary Fund, they brought out a report mentioning the fact that in Africa, that it might lead to social unrest due to the Ukraine and Russia crisis, and so it's already deepening inequality within and among countries. And so I would like to see that more attention are faced on this humanitarian crisis.
Let's come to the youngest member of our panel, Khadija from Tanzania, an award-winning youth reporter. What stories do you cover?
The stories which I cover, it's all about girls developing their countries, also women's. Because in Africa, women are like suspended. They cannot do something until nowadays. Although there are laws which are guiding them, they cannot do something. But through these programs which I'm doing, they can know that women, there still are people who can still develop our countries. They hold high ranks of government and they're still doing good. Like our president, Mama Samia Suluhu Hassan, she's bigging up in tourism industries by the Royal Tour film. Many tourists are coming Africa, visiting Tanzania, and we get income.
Wide range of issues we're hearing so far. Fatu, let's come to you. Fatu is a presenter and reporter with the Gambia's state broadcaster. Are these the kinds of stories that go on air, that when you go on air, are these the stories you cover?
Very much so. The Gambia is relatively a small country. We're a population of about just 2 million people. And we're a very peaceful country. People know us to be peaceful. And we're called the Smiling Coast of Africa. So we don't necessarily have very big issues. But we also battle with some of these things that happen across Africa as well. You know, from youth unemployment, from maternity issues, from sexual and gender-based violence. And up until now, we're still struggling to carry out these issues the way they should in the mainstream media, because when you come to social media, activists have taken the bull by the hand. You also have journalists that are passionate about these issues that are taking the conversation on social media. But when you come to the mainstream, those ethics, these guidelines, I think, have kind of limited to what extent we can cover some of these issues.
Okay, let's turn to someone who's done a bit of research into this kind of coverage on a wider scale. Moki Mukura, now you are the executive director at Africa No Filter. You've done a report on how Africa covers Africa. What kinds of stories are these that are being covered? Do they reflect what these panelists
they
are
don't.
saying.
They certainly don't reflect what Alvin said he wants to see, which is more good news, more positive news, more feature-type stories. What we found was that almost 81% of the stories we picked up that Africans are reading in African media about other African countries was negative. It was hard news, and by definition, hard news tends to be negative news. So it was the humanitarian crises that you're talking about. So we're getting a lot of coverage on that sort of news. What we found was missing was the human interest stories, was the stories of arts and culture. I mean, when you think about Africa, what is our biggest export? If it's not Afro beats, it's music, but we don't cover it. We don't cover the industry. We don't cover the sector. So there is a lot missing, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
All right, let's turn. We've got two editors on the panel today. We'll start with Agre Mutambo. You are the news editor at the East African. These issues have been talked about. Why are we not seeing them in the news?
As a news editor, I would prefer even to have more of those culture stories. But sometimes African newsrooms also lack capacity. So you will find that the newsroom is relying on the wire sources as the news sources. So sometimes because the wire sources are sort of directed at a certain viewpoint of Africa, sometimes we have to publish the stories that are just published elsewhere else. And that is a problem because one thing we need to do as African media houses probably is to share a lot of content between ourselves, and that one will help maybe tell the African story in a better way.
Let's turn to Richard Walker, DW's chief international editor, but you were also head of the newsroom for a bit. How do we decide what stories are top, that make it to the very top of the news?
Yeah, well, it's a kind of classic sort of question for journalists, isn't it? But you can say that sometimes it comes down to a kind of a combination of sort of urgency and timeliness, you know, what has just happened, a kind of a judgment about the impact, and then often kind of proximity, like how close is that, is often a question that media will ask. Now, of course, when you in a regional media where you're serving either one country or one region, then proximity is one thing. But for Deutsche Welle, we're global, you know, so we kind of have multiple levels in which we view the kind of proximity to us. So that, I think, is the challenge that our newsroom will sometimes face, is like, what is really then close to us when we're sitting back at base in Berlin? And this is where you have when you have a major meta story going on in Europe, for instance, like the Ukraine war, then of course something that's so close, such a major crisis that hasn't happened in decades in Europe, will start to have that risk of kind of crowding things out.
I'll just keep it with you for a second. You've also covered, under your remit has been India, for example. India is a country of over 1 billion people. Yet, the news coverage doesn't seem as if India is a 1-point-something billion country. And we could say the same about many African countries. Conflict in Mali and Burkina Faso. We've got the food crisis in the Horn of Africa. We've got Ethiopia. Why are those, in terms of their importance, not making it up there and with such frequency?
I'm just back recently from India, where I was there for a week, kind of covering what's going on in India geopolitically. And India is coming under a lot of pressure from the West to make a kind of a big break with Russia. You know, India has historical, quite close ties with Russia. European countries, the West generally, are saying to the Indians, you must stop buying Russian energy. You need to make a kind of diplomatic break with Russia because of the invasion of Ukraine. And it was quite interesting, one thing that the Indian foreign minister said when I was there. He said, basically, whenever Europe has a problem, it's everybody's problem. But when we have a problem, it's our problem. And that was something that really kind of remained in my mind, because I think, there's still obviously quite a sort of a strong dominance in the West of kind of what has a sense of sort of international narrative. And I think if India can get crowded out, then of course many other countries that don't even have the size of India will get crowded out more.
But one thing that has really changed in the way stories are covered is the power of social media. Social media has given people a platform to be able to raise their stories and gain the mainstream media's attention. Adenike, let's come to you. How have you seen that work in terms of social media being used as a platform to influence the global discourse.
Looking at the fact that sometimes we get low coverage on media, and the largest platform that we could leverage our activism could be on social media, that could make our voices to be heard beyond our boundaries, and also looking for solutions that when we raise our voice, we call for equal representation within, and very specific about things that affect Africa, looking at how the media, especially the Western media, have been giving a lot of attention to the Ukraine-Russia crisis. We have issues like the Lake Chad Ogoni crisis, but we aren't getting this kind of huge spotlight on all of those issues. It never lasts maybe a day or two.
One place where we have seen the use of social media to amplify a story is Cameroon. Brenda, can you tell us how that's working with the Anglophone, the crisis in the Anglophone region?
That's why up to this moment we are 6 years into the Anglophone crisis, and we see no hope so far. We are thinking maybe in 25 years, because social media has been used by most activists and it continues to be used. All the platforms, WhatsApp, even when these people are banned on Facebook, they go to WhatsApp, which is an area where the government can't really control, they can't do anything. So social media has really been effective to prolong this crisis, and it has led to what? Hate speech. A lot of hate speech, a lot of fake news. So the social media is good, but the effects in Cameroon, especially when it comes to the Anglophone crisis, we sometimes will say, okay, we should limit digital rights because it's really a dangerous tool that has been used so far to amplify voices, but it encourages hate.
That's an interesting point of view. Any thoughts on what she's just said about regulating? Fatu, let's come to you.
Not necessarily regulating, but when I did a study on media choices and decision making in my bachelor's, I realized that a lot of young people took their conversation on social media because they felt that their stories were not really captured on mainstream. But it also does not dispute the fact that these young people feel that there's so much fake news and misinformation on the mainstream. But still, this is where they're able to, amplify their causes. This is where they're able to represent themselves. So it also begs the question of to what extent do we as the media also cover these stories that matter to young people? How many times are we covering young people that are doing exceptionally well, whether it's in small businesses that they own, how they're disrupting narratives? How many times are we covering this? So it means as long as we continue to deny them that power, or if that's the word, as long as we don't give them that power, they will continue to be present on social media and they will put this information out the way they feel is best to be put out. So we have the authority or the obligation still to represent public interest, to represent public opinion, and if we do not take control of that narrative or really take charge of our responsibility as journalists, we'll continue to see, like what she mentioned, fake news, misinformation, at a larger scale.
How can the media keep authorities more accountable?
We've had a challenge where the social media is used by the audience to challenge us to report certain stories. And I can tell you that in some cases they even challenge us to sort of correct our mistakes. And this becomes a very useful thing because the authorities have always used the media to sort of tell stories that they want and not necessarily to tell the stories that the people want.
Why do they have so much power over the media?
I think media ownership, for example, the political environment, and just who is advertising on the media platforms. And so if you put these three factors together, you realize that even if they're telling you that you're independent, you will be inclined to report editorially in a certain angle. And so because sometimes the audience feel sort of exhausted looking at this kind of narrative, they then use the social media to challenge us.
Interesting. Oh, you have your hand up, Khadija.
For example, in Tanzania, many medias are not balanced in both sides, like Deutsche Welle. Well, Deutsche Welle, when it's black, and when it's blue, it's blue. It's balanced. But in Tanzania, they have no freedom to balance themselves because maybe the one who is owning that media is a politician. So he or she is governing the the media that you should put this and this and this in media, but they have no freedom to talk about the external things.
Agree. Let's come back to you. I mean, that's a clear challenge to media independence. You've hinted at it, but she's even made that's also evident in Tanzania. What's your response?
Well, I think it gives us a challenge to look for newer opportunities for revenue generation, because journalism is very expensive and quality journalism is much more expensive. So what we do is we can choose to tell the story of the politicians as they want it and they pay us, or we can choose to go a very different way and generate some money and make it sure that the audience can get something quality and pay for it. And many of us in Kenya, for example, we are trying to do that. I think it's going to take a long time because it's a new challenge we are taking on. But I think we are heading there.
So it's an issue that we know what stories to cover, but we're just not covering them because your hands are tied, essentially?
Like I said earlier, we have a challenge of capacity. I mean, I would want stories from Cameroon, from South Sudan, from Somalia, for example, but I just don't have the personnel there sometimes. So I have to rely on Reuters, I have to rely on DW, I have to, and so DW also has its own editorial goals, and so they may tell a story that is not necessarily African narrative, but at least they will tell us the stories.
Itching to take on Agri because I run an organisation called Africa No Filter, and we launched a product called Bird, which was in direct response to that report we did about how African media covers Africa. Because what we saw clearly was African media didn't have access because they didn't have 54 correspondents in 54 countries. So they were dependent on global news agencies. But we formed one, we created one called Bird. We have soft news stories, we have feature stories, we have human interest stories. But do the media editors take it? No, they don't. And that's why I'm saying that there is still an old style of thinking and journalism in African newsrooms, that if it bleeds, it leads. That's the only kind of thing we're going to run. And there isn't a sufficient interest in what their actual readership wants to read, because we have research that shows that young people want to read feature stories. They want human interest stories. They want stories that are just inspiring. The blood and guts, it's too much. So I think that there's an opportunity to just rethink the way we do news right now on the continent, because there's demand for it. And if you can pull up your audience figures, get the right people reading it, then you're not so dependent on the politicians who pay you.
Isn't it the job of the journalist to convince people that this story matters, to pitch to your editors and convince them that the story matters, but also to their audiences?
It is our job to do so. But editors, when somebody gets into journalism, when he creates his paper, he's all journalist, all journalism. Along the line, he changes. He is now into a money-making mission. So when you bring in topics like sexual reproductive health rights, he will look at the pitch. Obviously, it's good, but he will not want to see it published. He will prefer stories that says 10 people have died, because those stories will will boom. They are bad taste and they will sell. So he prefers such stories. I think we also need somebody who can set a pace. For instance, Moki, I'm surprised I'm meeting her here. She doesn't know I'm one of those people she has used that is benefiting from her. She set a space on sexual reproductive health rights, which is underreported in my country. And from there, I'm moving on, and I'm moving on in that direction.
Let's look forward. I mean, because the international media has this reputation for the way in which it covers Africa, and as if there's a set narrative. How do we change that?
Yeah, I mean, DW has been working on this a lot across the organization in recent years. And DW, of course, has an advantage in doing that and a special obligation to do that because such a huge amount of our audience is in the region. So we're definitely making efforts at DW, whether it's formats like the 77% or Eco Africa or a lot of our other formats, which are really trying to get some of the stories that we're kind of talking about here to our audiences, not just in the region, but internationally. But still, we've got a long way to go. And I think that it comes down to a lot of things. It comes down to teams. It comes down to our presence in the region. region, you know, extending the bureaus that we have there, getting more people from the region to come here to join teams here, to have that representation within all of our teams, for the people who can say when this story comes up, this is close to me, this matters to my people back home, let's jump on that story.
Shouldn't it also be the job of the people in the newsroom to say that, oh, wow, that story from Cameroon is so big, it should be the top story in our global news bulletin.
Absolutely. So I think there's a lot to do. DW has advantages in trying to do that, but definitely also special responsibilities to be ahead.
I'll come to you, Fatu. What about on your platform? How can things change? How can you and your colleagues change the way these stories are done?
I think the Western media has succeeded in kind of setting the standard of what journalism or good journalism is. That is politics, war, and all these things that are happening across the world. And I think I understand because they have, you know, a bigger representation and they're operating at a very international scale. But like you were mentioning, how do we localize then the content? Because these things are important, but how much more of our stories are we projecting in the news? In fact, I don't go on coverage. I prefer going for my own story because I want to see the stories that I know young people are passionate about and the people really care about, rather than having the president on top of the headline every single day, because he is the president, right? And now we are leaving out, you know, the percentage of the population that really matters, and they have their own issues that they are passionate about.
And very quickly, Aldrin, let's hear your point of view on how we can move this forward.
We need to have a different conversation about our relationship with power and how we understand power. Sure, politician, very important. However, though, is the politician set to be the person who must set the agenda? So we need to now have a shift, and also with the online audience. The online audience is saying something to us. Sure, right now they're not giving you the revenue because these are people who don't necessarily have disposable income, but they are the adults of tomorrow. So they are telling you and they're giving you the cue that says that this is the type of content that we are interested in.
Brenda, I'll give you that last word. How can that move forward in Cameroon, for example?
I think journalists should forget about how money, like, keep the finances aside. Sometimes you sponsor your own stories. Be that change, lead that change. Because if you keep waiting for editors to come in, you will keep reporting what editors want, like the angle that they choose to be, but surprising them with good stories about Africa, African young leaders. They are going to have them. It depends on how we write these stories. So I think the journalist has the pen, and the journalist can lead the change.
So we're hearing about collaboration. We're hearing about reviewing the way we look at the news. We're hearing about listening to our audiences. And I think that is a lot for us to take away, that there is quite a lot to do. But for you, who's just watched this conversation and listened to what's been said, what do you think? Let us know. This has been 77%. Thanks for joining us.